Auntie.
Our next speaker.
Our next speaker is
none other than
Vicky Tauli Corpuz.
Vicky has really a very, very important role. Right now, she is working for the United Nations, right, Vicky? I don't want to make a mistake. So I'm just going to call on Vicky to come on down and talk more about what she does. But we know that she actually is a firm believer and a very, very active person in the pursuit of human rights. Thank you very much, Mia and Mark, and thank you to the Igorot Global Organization for inviting me to speak before you. You know, I attended the IGO in Virginia because I happened to be in the US that time, and in Ifugao I went to speak in the session in Ifugao. But this is really an important moment for me, mainly because first of all, of course, I'd like to share briefly my story on how I ended up in this role. By the way, I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. So I was appointed to this post by the Human Rights Council of the UN in 2014, and my mandate as a Special Rapporteur is to monitor how the human rights of indigenous peoples all over the world are protected, respected, and fulfilled. So for me to be able to do this mandate, I do official country visits where the country officially invites me to go and look at the situation of indigenous people. So this has allowed me to visit indigenous peoples in their villages, in their own communities, as well as to enter into dialogues with government officials and other UN officials, as well as the private sector. So my role is to really communicate with these decision makers what I have observed and concluded in the visits that I do, and I tell them, I make recommendations on how they should address this. So I make a report before the Human Rights Council once a year, and I also go to the General Assembly in New York and present a report as well. So this is what I do, and then I communicate. I write to the governments whenever I receive an allegation of a human rights violation against indigenous peoples. Then I communicate, I write an official letter to the government, and I ask them to respond to some of the questions that I ask. So this in a nutshell is what I'm doing right now. But before I move into the main gist of what I'm going to present, I just wanted to give a brief history of myself. You know, whenever you go to an indigenous community, they will ask you, ay sino ka? Ay sino nang anak ng sika? Diba? They will always ask that question. And so I think it's proper that we do that because we want to know who is this person coming to our village and what does she want to do. So as a member, I'm Vicky Tauli Corpuz. I am from Busao. My parents are from the barrio of Payo in Busao Mountain Province, and my parents are actually belong to the first generation of educated Igorot in Busao. No? So my father is an Anglican priest, and my mother is a nurse. My grandparents, from my father's side, is the Tauli, and then my mother's side is Ambukay. So my grandfather, who is Ambukay, Agustin Ambukay, was actually the first presidente of Busao, because during the Spanish period, I think they called them presidente. They're actually mayors. No, so he was the presidente, and most probably he sort of left some of his genes for leadership to some of us. So anyhow, as a kid, I was born in Baguio, but my parents, at a very early age, they decided to send us back every now and then to our town, to our ili in Payo. And so, as a young person, I've been taught a lot by my grandmother, my alapugipaan, who is the one who taught us a lot about the values that we all cherish, no? For instance, the value of inayan. You know, inayan means don't do it. You are, you know, it's really the philosophy of a lot of indigenous peoples, where you are not supposed to do bad things, no? And in fact, my grandmother will always say, "Adi kayo alamid sing ngawi tayo nung baki kayo awat ibayaw ganang ngawi ay alamid you." You know, in our culture during death ritual, during the wake. There is such a thing called bayao, no, where people come and sing and chant, you know, before the death. But when they chant, it's not like the dominant eulogies where they only talk about the good things about a person. They also talk about the bad things you did when you were alive. So for me, and my grandfather always tells us, he said, you know, that's the best incentive, because can you imagine if you are so bad and you are dead, and people come to your wake and they will talk about all the bad things you did, then all your children, your grandchildren, your family will be so ashamed of you. So you really need to be good while you are living on earth. And I think that's really, for me, that's something that makes a big difference. And I love going to the wakes, because that's where you learn about your genealogy, the story of your family, isn't it? They will say, oh, you know, this person came from this lineage, and that his mother is from that. So you learn a lot. It's really a very, very important learning process for me, and that's where I learned about a lot of course, my own genealogy, you know, my lineage. So that's really one of the things my grandmother taught as well. And then the other thing is ayu, di ba? Ayu, which is, I don't know how to translate ayu in English. But anyway, it's don't waste anything, isn't it? That's basically what it means, that don't waste food, recycle whatever you need to recycle, reuse whatever you need to reuse, and don't waste, and don't be extravagant, and don't destroy, you know, the earth, which is the source of life for all of us. So even before concepts of carbon footprints, the green economy, or sustainable development have emerged, we already have those concepts. And I think that those lessons taught to us really have been embedded in our own minds. And this is what also defines us as a people. Jay Watan earlier spoke about the values, the culture of the Igorot. So I won't go into all of those. And it's really what he said about the sense of community, the importance of family, the importance of all the values that we believe in terms of reciprocity, solidarity. All these are really taught to us at very young ages. And maybe that's precisely why there is such a thing called as ego, isn't it? Because we believe we believe in all those values, and we believe that we would like to transmit these values and cultures to our future generations. And I saw in the program of this conference that the questions being asked is, how do you ensure that your cultures and values are transmitted in a modern and mixed world? You know, of course, culture is ever evolving. There is no such thing as a static culture. So when you have to live in a bigger framework where there are other cultures, you have to adapt as well. But the foundation, the core of what you are, of your identity as a person and as a community, has to be there, because otherwise that's where we see young people who are really who have a sense of meaninglessness. No, nowadays there is a very strong and renewed sense of claiming identity. No, in a world which is highly globalized, or hyper-individualism, you know, competition, speed, alienation, as well as incessant consumption, and unsustainable production are given much more premium than anything. This is where we find a lot of people finding a lot of, having a lot of anxiety over what's going to be in store for them for the future, and whether they can continue to live meaningful lives. as an individual and as collectives, as a community. So when I was young, I was a grade 7 in St. James School. I passed an exam a national exam to go to Manila, to the Philippine Science High School, and that was in the 1960s, 1966. And at that time, when I was in Manila, I was in Quezon City, that was the height of activism of the students. So the activists in UP, they come to our campus and try to brainwash us and all. But that was also the height of the problems that we were facing in the Cordillera. That was when we heard first about the Chico River Dam, which was going to the Chico River, which was going to be, 4 dams are going to be built. And that was also when the Self-Fill Resources Corporation exploded in Abra, where they were going to log the forests in Abra, and including the mountain province, even in Busao, Sagada, as well as the Ilocos. So being activists that time, we thought that, why don't we deal with the problems in our own communities instead of dealing with these huge national problems? So that's how we got involved with the issue. Then of course we found out that so I've been going to Bugnay, I've been meeting some of the leaders, and then we witnessed some of the atrocities that were caused. There were several communities bombed, and many people were arrested and tortured, and until eventually Macli Indulag, who was one of the leaders, was killed. So we tried to look for a redress for this, and we started looking around. And of course, martial law was declared in 1972, so there was simply no redress mechanism. And so we thought, and that's when we started understanding that at the UN, there is such a thing called the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And so we started reaching out to the United Nations. And at that time, in 1972, there were already discussions about indigenous peoples, because Native Americans, the First Nations in Canada, the Aborigines in Australia, have been going to the UN, the Maoris of New Zealand, have been going to the UN trying to present their problems as well, because we have similar problems. Their lands were taken away, they were displaced from their communities, etc. So we found each other, and we all got together to get the UN to draft a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. And so we started the work. The drafting started in 1985, and it went on and on for 20 years, until finally it was adopted in 2007. But even if it took that long, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been a very important instrument for indigenous peoples worldwide, because it just doesn't recognize the individual human rights of indigenous peoples, but also their collective rights, which means your right to culture, your right to your lands, territories, and resources, your right to an identity, among others. So all the issues we're talking about here are contained in the instrument, which is now universally adopted. When it was adopted in 2007, only 148 countries voted yes for it, and only four countries voted against it. And these countries were the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So these were the 4 countries who said, no, we don't accept this declaration. It so happened that at that time, I was the chair of a new UN body that was set up called the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And this is based in New York. This meets in New York. I was the chair for 5 years. And I had the opportunity to talk to the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So I convinced them that there's nothing wrong. They should change their position, because these issues are indeed issues that the indigenous peoples face. And finally, in 2009, all these governments came to the United Nations and they said, okay, we now endorse the declaration. So that was a major feat, that we managed to get these 4 countries to agree to the declaration. And since then, that has been an instrument that is used by indigenous peoples worldwide to claim for their rights and to complain when these rights are being violated. The important thing about the declaration, aside from the fact that it does recognize collective human rights, is that it really, I mean, that's one of the most important contributions actually of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to international human rights law. Those of you who know more about human rights, if you recall, this is only about individual human rights. So it talks about the individual. But the indigenous peoples have been coming to the UN and said, no, we don't agree that it's just the individual, because we come here as communities, as nations, as peoples, and we want to assert that we do have rights as peoples because of the distinct history of oppression, discrimination, and racism that we have faced since colonization until the creation of the nation states. If you recall, when the nation states were created, usually the nation says there is one culture, one language, one nation. And indigenous people said, huh? There are many cultures, many languages, and many nations. So you cannot just be imposing on us this one nation, one culture, one language framework, because in the end, that was really what destroyed a lot of the indigenous nations all over the world. So that was a major contribution of the declaration, aside from the fact that it stressed a lot about the right to culture. Of course, the right to culture is a collective right. You don't just have a culture as an individual. You have culture in relationship with others, isn't it? So your culture is usually a culture of a community, of a tribe, of a nation, and so you cannot just reduce, culture as a right of an individual. No such thing. So that was the other contribution of the declaration, and of course, it recognized the inherent rights of indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources, which has to some laws, national laws, which do recognize that. And in the Philippines, as you may all know, finally the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act was passed in 2000, was it 2007 as well? No, 1997. No, it was passed in 1997, even before the declaration was adopted. And that does recognize collective rights. So these were some of the major accomplishments of indigenous peoples, aside from the fact that indigenous peoples contribute to the world's diversity. In the world today, there is like 6,900 something languages, and almost 5,000 of these languages are spoken by indigenous peoples. No? So we contribute a lot to cultural diversity, because linguistic diversity is part of cultural diversity. And also we contribute in biodiversity, the diversity of life on Earth. It has been found out by scientists, but while indigenous peoples in the world occupy 22% of the land area, 80% of the world's biodiversity is found in indigenous peoples' territories. No? And why? Because indigenous peoples have this ethic or value of caring for the earth, living, treading softly in the world, no? Indigenous peoples have values that say, they have the seventh generation principle, especially among the Native Americans, but I think we do have that as well, which means that whatever you do, you have to think of the consequences of this for the future generation, for 7 generations of indigenous peoples ahead. So if you, for instance, destroy your land, think about the consequences up to those future generations, and that's where the concept saying that the earth belongs to the future generations, because indeed, as present generations, that is the obligation we have for them. And that's why the new generation of of indigenous leaders is a very important development that we need to support fully. The second thing that we also have found out is our concept of a community. For many people, the community is just the present community. But for indigenous peoples, the community is the past, the present, and the future. The past, we want to revere our ancestors. We want to capture and learn about the traditional knowledge of our ancestors, why they have maintained the forest in the best ways they can, the ecosystem in the best ways they can, which is now being proven, with the data that I mentioned earlier. 80% of the world's biodiversity are found in indigenous peoples' territories. And then the community of the present, and the community of the future. The present, and we also regard community not just as people, not just as us, but community, which includes all the living and non-living beings, the seen and the unseen, you know, and that's community. We don't talk of community as ourselves alone. So that's another thing that indigenous peoples have in common. And thirdly, indigenous peoples, have the 7th generation principle, which says that you cannot just do something that will in the end be bad for the people 7 generations ahead. So community to us is the past community, the present community, and the future. And if we have that holistic view of a community, that defines the behavior, the values, and the culture that we have as people. So when we have our rituals, we always say thank you to our ancestors, but we also think and pray for the future generations. So these are just some of the facets of indigenousness, which I hope the IGO, the International Global Organization, will further amplify and reinforce, because this is what we are going to leave behind for our future generations. I think that the International Global Organizations has a very important role to play, because you come from all parts of the world, and yet you still continue to exercise your own cultures. You come together as a distinct people, as Patrick has said earlier, as a nation. You know, we are, basically we are a nation, because we have our own territory to speak of, we have our own culture, we have our own borders, we have our own languages, you know, and that is what defines a nation. We have our own indigenous systems of governance as well as indigenous systems of justice. No? So these are the characteristics of indigenous peoples in many parts of the world. And I'm telling you now, with the meaninglessness, the alienation that's happening worldwide, a lot of people are looking up to indigenous peoples to show them what community, living in a community means. And I think in light of these kinds of problems, the challenges that we face, whether this is climate change, this extreme nationalism, you know, the problems of homogenization and the imposition of the dominant cultures. It really, indigenous peoples are really the ones who can show the way. While we are adversely affected by climate change, indigenous peoples are also showing that they are the ones who are able to adapt to climate change compared to the rest of the world, because of the knowledge system that we have, which has now been recognized under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So I'd like to end by saying that these are the contributions we have. We will look forward to the Indigenous Global Organization to further support the efforts of indigenous peoples to empower, strengthen their own communities, show that they can self-govern and they can even govern better. You know, I saw I was in Mexico. I visited some of the countries I visited are Brazil, Mexico, the United States. I officially visited last year. Australia I did also last year. But what I have seen in Mexico, which sometimes when we hear of Mexico, it's like the drug cartels are the ones in power, etc. But the indigenous communities managed to get rid. Some communities have managed to get rid of the drug cartels. They got rid of the politicians who are in cahoots with the drug cartels. And they held their own elections, and they now are ruling their own communities, choosing their own leaders, and not allowing even political parties to come into campaign, because they think that these political parties are not reliable because of these kinds of pollution that they have. So I have seen a lot of autonomous municipalities which are really showing and exercising their right to self-determination, their right to govern themselves. And I see these communities as sources of hope in a world that's really meeting all these challenges that we talked about. So I'd like to end by a poem. This is a poem by an event elder in Russia. There are indigenous peoples there as well. And this poet said, "If I forget my native speech and the songs that my people sing, what use are my eyes and ears? What use is my mouth? If I forget the smell of the earth and do not serve it well, what use are my hands? Why am I living in this world? How can I believe the foolish idea that my language is weak and poor if my mother's last words were evenki?" So this is something that I'd like to leave for you because this is what EGO should be for now and for the future. And thank you again to the youth for helping organize this meeting and for inviting me. Thank you very much.
The Igorot Global Organization Certificate of Appreciation is presented to Vicky Tauli Corpuz, guest speaker, IGO, ICC 12. Signed this 3rd of August 2018 at the Hale Koa Hotel, Kalia Road, Honolulu, Hawaii. Gloria Simon present IGO. Usually those are in nice frame wood, but you know when you are traveling you can carry those wood. So we did have to bear with this piece of cardboard.